All right, so today, in case you haven't taken a look at the spreadsheet, what we're trying to do is to deal with kind of this whole issue of sustainability and also talk a little bit about sort of energy efficiency, public policy, that sort of thing, as it relates to real estate development, okay? And we're trying to quantify some of these things that some are easy to quantify, other things aren't. But the context of all of this is that over many years, folks have struggled with this whole thing of energy efficiency and sustainability and kind of, what sort of incentives, disincentives, should be offered, can be offered, how do they affect things, why should we even care about any of this? Everybody has an opinion, clearly, okay? The way I tend to look at it, as I can look at a lot of things, it's sort of a cost-benefit analysis, all right? And, it's the sort of thing of how much money is it going to cost me, how much benefit am I going to receive, and if the benefit outweighs the cost, then sure, let's do it, okay? And, yeah, sometimes it's a little bit difficult to purely quantify every little thing that, we're sort of dealing with, but we can certainly try. Now, what this little model that I created a couple of years ago attempts to do is to kind of go through line item by line item and identify some of the areas that are different between kind of a typical, normal, sort of ordinary building and then what I'm calling a highly energy efficient building. Now, the numbers that we popped up here for the time being don't really mean anything, okay? At the moment, we're going to sort of kind of walk through and sort of explain, what each of these are if they're not completely inherently obvious. But some, maybe aren't really obvious. And then ultimately, kind of over this far right, so we'll look at a line item basis, and overall, what sort of differences may exist between an energy efficient building and kind of an ordinary building, okay? All right, so the way I'm kind of defining, the ordinary building, this is what is kind of the minimum normal standard that a local jurisdiction, a local city government would allow or require for the purposes of being built within a particular city. And it could be, once again, an office building, could be a retail building, could be multifamily. That really doesn't matter, okay? Or at least not conceptually, it doesn't really matter. But here's an interesting thing to sort of put into motion. And I sort of said this a little bit last week, that depending on where you are in the country, this can vary a lot, okay? In terms of one local jurisdiction, and something like, for example, if you just think out loud, what cities across the United States would you think are the most heavily interested in sort of environmentally sustainable, kind of low energy consumption sort of buildings?
West Coast, New York City.
Okay, well, specific cities.
LA. San Francisco.
Okay, so let's just sort of take a list. Probably the top ones are going to be Portland and Seattle. Okay, followed by probably Austin, Texas. Okay, you're going to have a fair amount probably in Denver. Some of the bigger cities, they might surprise you as to whether or not they really get into the whole thing of sort of environmentally, sustainable, buildings. Simply because they have so many players that are trying to develop in those cities, they want to be as sort of open and lower cost as they possibly can be. And see, this is a really interesting dynamic for certain cities. Certain cities are known by developers as being low-cost cities to develop in. And I'm sure, Woody, your local expertise would far exceed anything that I've got, as it relates to that, like here in this local market. But my suspicion is you could rattle off 2 or 3 city names of where the cost of doing business you know, in terms of meeting, you know, certain building codes for that local jurisdiction are radically different than another one that may be literally across the street, okay? I mean, you would agree with that, yes?
Absolutely.
And so this is one of those things as a developer, you need to, obviously that's part of your kind of due diligence and, you know, kind of understanding what you're getting yourself into, you know, whenever you go to develop in a certain jurisdiction. That just because it's in the same state, just because it maybe is in the same geographic area, doesn't mean it's going to be treated, you know, the same as it relates to these standards. Because some cities, you know, by virtue of their elected officials, by virtue of their appointed officials, you know, have taken a sort of a stance and said, okay, we are going to hold all new construction to a certain standard that goes above and beyond whatever maybe the minimum standard is for compliance with some of these issues. Does that make sense? Yep.
Do you see that also on a neighborhood-to-neighborhood basis? Like, for example, by the beach here versus inland?
And not so much, it would be by jurisdiction, you know, that they're the ones that are going to be controlling it. It's a locally controlled thing. So if you have a separate local government that, you know, happens to be responsible for a strip of land, you know, adjacent to the beach, you know, it could be totally different for that strip here in Broward County versus a similar strip down in Dade. So it's not necessarily just, you know, where they're located within the city, but certain things may be driving it, you know. But most of the time, it's based upon kind of the mindset of the elected officials within that area. Now, this is where you theoretically, you know, those of you that want to, you know, talk a little bit about representative government, you know, you can kind of, you know, try to tap into some of that, because the idea is, you know, in a perfect democracy, you would have the people that are living within a particular, you know, area, a particular city, saying, okay, we want to elect people that have mindsets similar to ours as it relates to issues like this. That we want to create a city or have a city that has high development standards with, you know, ensuring that all buildings that within our city, you know, are as energy efficient as possible, and that they have, you know, long-term durability and so forth. And in a perfect world, hopefully that representation would occur. But then you also have other cities that may be driven by other forces. Maybe they're driven by not so much the people that live there, but maybe by local chambers of commerce or local, you know, sort of developers that may have a mindset that is not in sync with this at all. You know, that are just simply saying, I want to build really cheap houses and build as many of them as I can and stuff them into the community, and I don't really care about the long-term implications of the quality of those homes. I don't care about the long-term implications of the quality of the office buildings or anything else that gets built in that community. All I really care about is how I can make a quick buck, get in, get out, move on. And so it's really up to the local communities to be able to kind of step in and sort of say, do we want to hold ourselves to a higher standard, you know, as it relates to these things. Now, that having been said, I mean, I'll be the first to admit, I am not a big government kind of guy, okay? I tend to be very much of a limited government, you know, sort of a person as a general rule. However, one can easily make the argument that with much higher standards in terms of the local government control, it typically leads to a higher quality development. Now, that's not to say that you have to have artificial standards and that sort of thing. They're just kind of silly and stupid, but, you know, hopefully standards that actually make sense so that you hopefully get a better end product, you know, as a result of having these standards in place and the cost of development being higher. Because, you know, it's the sort of thing that if all of the development that occurs within that community is of a very high quality, then what, people are going to want to live there, people are going to pay more to live there, people are going to be happier probably to live there. Now, granted, sometimes it gets, you know, overkill, especially within certain homeowner associations. I mean, I'm sure some of you have, you know, and that's not really local government control as much as it is local deed restrictions that have been placed by a developer, you know, on a subdivision. So you have a homeowners association that in some cases doesn't really reflect the community at all. That, you know, it's just basically the people who want to constantly terrorize everybody else with, you know, making sure that their grass is only X number of inches high and that they don't put any pink flamingos out in their front yard or whatever it is, okay? But my point is all of this fundamentally comes down to sort of a regulatory framework and regulatory environment, but it also does come down to actual hard dollar cost as it relates to these things, okay? Now, so all that having been said, let's just sort of start here with the first line item. All right, so let's just say that we've got our ordinary building that's going to cost us $200 per square foot to build, and it's 100,000 square feet, and we're saying, okay, well that's going to be a $20 million building. We've got relatively cheap land of $150,000 to get us to a price point of total development cost of $20 million bucks. Well, $20,150,000. Okay, so up to this point, if we make the assumption that an ordinary building, just for the moment, and a highly energy efficient building are the same cost per square foot, which they can be, but in other instances they may not be. Okay, but that's where the model allows you that flexibility to kind of tinker around with. So the first real adjustment that we begin to make to the model is, are there any sort of governmental rebates for energy or sustainability that could drive down our construction costs, okay, or drive down our overall cost for doing this project? And so what we're saying is that with the ordinary building, okay, no rebates. But for the highly energy efficient building, they're willing to give us a $500,000 upfront rebate. Okay, does that make sense, everybody? Now, what is that rebate for? It doesn't really specify, but it could be, anything from, making sure that the building has a really high level of insulation. Could be also that you've got a situation of where you've used maybe solar panels, you've used really highly energy efficient windows, there could be a whole variety of things, but whatever it is, they've given you $500,000 to basically help to maybe offset those costs if there were additional costs, okay? But see, this is the part I want you to think about. And in some cities, you're really not even given the choice. In some cities, you have to build it to a relatively high standard of energy efficiency, okay? And so, in that case, it's just automatically your cost is going to be higher. But in this particular instance, we're sort of, for the moment, sort of saying it's not. Okay. So let's kind of move down the page here. We're going to come back to some of those here in just a second. Now we start talking about the project financing. All right? So what we're saying here, if you sort of look at these numbers, I'm not saying that this is realistic, unrealistic, these are just things to think about. Can we, if we approach a lender, possibly get a higher loan-to-value ratio for an energy-efficient building than we would get with an ordinary building, okay? What would be your logic in being able to try to achieve that? That your operating costs are lower, okay? Well, if your operating costs are lower, that's a good thing, right? So theoretically, the lender should take that into consideration and possibly say, okay, well, given your operating costs are substantially lower, we're going to give you a higher loan-to-value ratio, okay? Not a bad thing, all right? The loan term, we could potentially even change that and sort of say, okay, since we are using much more durable, maybe materials, more sustainable, long-term, possibly even a longer loan term. We didn't adjust it here, but that's, one way of sort of thinking about the logic. Okay, the interest rate. Once again, predominantly driven by the idea of having lower operating costs in a project, that should mean that you are potentially, or you're going to be more attractive even to potential tenants. So to what extent, once again, the lender may take all that into consideration and say, okay, we're going to offer you a lower interest rate. All right, now in the market, and I'm going to have you Google here in a second, is to actually, look around for lenders that do just this. Look for, energy efficient lenders. Look for basically, lead ratings relative to borrowing cost. What you're going to probably find is that there are very specific lenders that have already carved out a little bit of a niche in the market and said, okay, we want to be the lenders involved with properties that are pursuing, highly energy efficient, durable, sort of sustainable, projects, because we think they're going to be the better type of projects that are going to exist in the market. Does that make sense?
Why agree?
I'm sorry?
Why agree?
I'm sorry, one more time?
Why agree?
Why green?
That's a big one that does that.
Oh, okay. Why green? Okay. All right. Same sort of things. We kind of move on down the page. We look at these inputs. Okay. The debt service coverage ratio. Once again, all getting back to those lower operating costs. If you have lower operating costs, that means you're going to hopefully have a more stabilized income, which hopefully means the lender's going to respect that and potentially offer you a much more attractive debt service coverage ratio than they might offer you otherwise. Now this is the part that begins to be interesting, okay? Line 24, the actual total operating expenses as a percentage of EGI. So what we might find is that for the normal building, those operating expenses would be, let's say, 35%, whereas for the energy efficient one, maybe only 15%, okay? Could even be lower than that. I mean, you could even have a property that generates enough electricity, enough water, enough other sort of sustainable systems in place to where they don't have to, they can be completely off the grid, okay? Completely self-sustaining, okay? Where you really wouldn't have any sort of operating costs affiliated with it. This is probably, in my mind, one of the most valuable lessons. Once you hear this, if you haven't heard this before, it's one of those things, in my mind, that sticks with you. What kind of organizations initially were drawn really heavily into the idea of sustainability and low energy cost and that sort of thing, even if the initial cost was substantially higher to achieve all of that?
Technology.
Okay, I hear colleges, I hear technology.
Office.
What, sorry?
Cars,
He said hospital.
No, I'm not with buildings.
hospitals.
Hospitals, possibly?
Data centers.
Yeah, probably data centers. You're missing some big ones, though.
Anything that's got longevity to it where they're thinking, 50, 60, 75 years down the road.
What headquarters?
Government.
Government is a big one. Churches. Churches, hospitals,
That church saw you
a
like
lot of
one day a week.
a lot of nonprofits, and there's a reason for that. Okay, this is the part that I said will stick with you. Think of the kind of organizations that you give money to. Okay, where their operating base, if you will, is driven by donations. Okay, it's a whole lot easier for them to go out and raise money one time for a building and make that building the most energy efficient, sustainable building with no operating cost whatsoever than it is for them to go out after they have the building built and then come back to you every month, every year and say, oh, we need a bunch of money for operating expenses. Because from a fundraising perspective, it's a whole lot easier to get that initial dollar amount, and spend, let's say, $10 million on building a building that's exceedingly energy efficient than to build a building for, let's say, $6 million and then have to chase constantly year after year after year after year to get those operating funds to pay for the water, the sewer, the electricity, and everything else. Does that make sense? Okay, and as I said, governments tend to fall in that category, especially if the entity behind it is really thinking about kind of how much of a challenge they may have in the future of getting those costs covered, okay? And you have forward-thinking sort of folks within those government entities. So I can't stress that enough, that those kind of are some of the first, people sort of into the game of this whole energy efficiency kind of sustainability piece. Now, that having been said, the folks that have been the laggards, for the most part, have been your traditional real estate developers, because I think as we sort of said maybe last week or the week before, we talked a little bit about this, was these folks are saying, all right, I build an office building, I build a shopping center, I build an apartment community, but once it's built, all the utilities are the responsibility of the tenant, so what possible motivation do I have as the developer to try to reduce those costs for the tenant? Because I'm not the one paying the bill, they are. And so for many years, that was the mindset behind, a lot of developers, was we just don't care. The fact that we're, putting the most energy inefficient air conditioning system in this building, that's okay, we're not paying the bill, but it's cheap, okay, for us up front. But over time, certain tenants, especially corporate tenants, that actually would own and operate their own facilities, began to say, well, wait a second, let's, be a bit more critical on this because, and believe it or not, Walmart was one of the first major corporate, owners of real estate that sort of said, hey, we want our buildings to be as energy, efficient as possible. And so one of the things they began to tinker with, initially were putting in skylights, and they would have the system set up to where the skylights would obviously serve as much of the natural light as possible, and then the interior lights would adjust accordingly depending on what would be happening on the outside. So they would have obviously light sensors on the inside to say, okay, there's not very much sunlight, so let's turn up the interior lights to a certain level, and then if all of a sudden it reverses, then obviously they do that. And that's just one example, but the point being is, these are the sorts of things that, one has to, begin to think about the motivations of these property owners. Another one of the big early adopters were hotels, which would make logical sense. They are paying their own electric bills, their own, water bills, and so forth. So, I mean, can you imagine going to a hotel, checking out the next day, and they say, oh, by the way, here's your water bill, here's your electricity bill, here's, the sewer bill, here's your, all these, individual compartmentalized, components. You'd think, that's insane, okay? But they could do it. I mean, theoretically they could. If they really wanted to, they could actually, and some of you, I don't think most of you heard this story, but if you've had me before, there's a chance that you've heard the story. So, about 20 years ago, we took a group of students from Texas A&M down to Australia for a study abroad trip. And one of the locations that we took the folks was a place on Curran Cove in South Stradbroke Island, close to Brisbane. And it was supposed to be, at the time, this world-class eco-tourist sort of resort. And the course that we were delivering down there was a sustainability-focused course. And we had picked this particular location because it had won all these, international sort of accolades to all the things that it had done. And so we were super excited about going down there and learning more about what they had done, what the developer had done, and so forth. So we get there, and one of the very first things that hits you is you go into your room, you flip on the TV, and it actually shows you in real time your electricity consumption, your water consumption, your sewage consumption, or sewage use, not consumption. But it shows you all that on the screen, literally in real time, and it shows you your use relative to everybody else on a per sort of unit basis within the, and none of us had ever seen anything, like this. Once again, that's like 20 years ago. And so we'd never seen anything like this. We were all just absolutely instantly amazed, and so they brought us in, and they were, and part of the reason they did it was out of necessity, to a certain extent it was out of necessity, because they were on an island, okay? And so they were having to produce their own electricity. They were having to basically, for the most part, desalinate the water that was being used, and also deal with the treatment of the sewage, so all of that was being done on site, okay? So, you know, you think about that, and there's also some parallels here. Did you know, and I'll get back to that story in a second, but did you know that the water for Key West doesn't come from Key West? They have to actually transport the water via, obviously, you know, kind of an aqueduct sort of thing, but basically from South Miami. Yeah, most people don't realize that. There is no fresh water in Key West, or certainly not enough to be able to sustain Key West, okay? A lot of people don't really realize that, but I mean, it's an interesting little, you know, tidbit about them, and you know, they've got all kinds of weird, quirky issues down there, but that's just the beginning of the heat. But my point is, sometimes those are the kinds of things that drive some of these sustainability initiatives, are these, you know, necessities that are born out of unique circumstances. I mean, you know, you think about other parts of the country that, you know, have a lack of fresh water, that, you know, in the middle of Arizona or the middle of Nevada or whatever, that once again, that's going to be of a huge priority to them, whereas maybe not so much to us, okay? So anyway, so getting back to the story about the Australia thing. So we get there, we're just amazed. They bring us in, they're telling us about all their cost savings, you know, affiliated with this, you know, and I haven't given the best part of the story, but there's two really best parts of the story. So they bring us in, they tell us all this, and they say, at the time, my recollection was, they had shaved off like 35% of their operating cost, what would be normal operating cost, by virtue of this whole monitoring thing. And we were like, huh? You know, how are you saving that much money by, you know, just this monitoring? Then the big reveal came, where they said, okay, here's what we are doing. Every night, we have a contest. And the contest is, of the several hundred units that are there, whoever uses the least of everything combined, they get a free night.
So fun.
So now this is a place that, once again, back then, 20 years ago, they were charging like $350, $400 a room. Okay, not a cheap place to stay. But imagine that virtually everybody staying at this island, they're not showering, they're not using the toilets, they're not turning on the lights, they're not turning on the TVs, they're not doing any of that. They're literally just sleeping in the rooms because they want to be the winner, you know, to a certain extent of, you know, this sort of, you know, free night. And it was just, it was mystifying, you know, how much of an impact that really had, you know, on the consumption patterns. So you've got a bunch of smelly, nasty people to a certain extent, you know, all walking around. But, okay, so we sort of fast forward, probably, I don't think when I did this, not quite 10 years ago, but at least let's say 10 years into the future. And I took another small group to Australia, and that was one of the places I wanted to put on the agenda. So I did. We get there, and you know, still looks beautiful, you know, amazing place. Walk in, you know, to the room, you know, and I'm like, oh, hey, I want to show everybody, you know, how all this, you know, works and everything. And so, you know, pop on the TV and can't find it, you know, anywhere. And I'm like, what the heck happened to, you know, this whole monitoring thing? And so I'm really frustrated, and, you know, take everybody and say, oh, let's just go to the front desk and let's, you know, find out what's going on. And, well, no one at the front desk knew at all what I was even talking about. So, you know, eventually you find somebody, manager, that'd been there for a while. Anyway, they were like, oh, yeah, we did away with that a few years ago. And I'm like, why? Well, because it was incompatible with our on-demand movie system, and we were making more money off of the on-demand movies than we were with the savings that was coming from the. I was just like, really? You know, so this is what goes to show you that sometimes.
They don't care about the environment. They care
Well,
about money.
it's just ultimately at the end of the day, it really is to a certain extent, you know, about money. You know, but if you can, you know, have people watching 2 or 3 movies and on demand back then, you know, would have been probably, I don't know, you know, $5–10 a movie or something like that. So that right there, you know, pretty much as you could see, would probably offset the cost or offset the benefit of this sort of thing. But it's just interesting, you know, how these things, you know, tend to morph and change over time, and what, you know, was sort of the cutting edge then, and you know, what we've become accustomed to now. But imagine, I guess, and this is, you know, the mindset I want to put you in just for a moment, but Imagine if you were in a work setting or even at your own home where in real time you honestly saw real numbers of what your costs of consumption were. That every time you literally turned on the faucet, there was a little, LCD thing there saying, okay, your water bill, is going up by X number of pennies or dollars or whatever. Every time you turn on the air conditioner, you see in real time, here's how much it's going up. Every time you flush the toilet, every time you do anything, you see a real time, kind of a representation of that in terms of, the cost. Don't you think that would modify people's behavior? Okay, I'm not suggesting we do it, but I'm just saying, but don't you think that would probably modify people's behavior? Because, I mean, you can sort of say, well, maybe people that are really wealthy, it wouldn't modify their behavior at all, but you would certainly think that people, sort of middle income America, that if they saw that every time they did one of those things, well, there's $1.50 or there's $2 or there's, whatever for flipping on the light switch and or turning up the air conditioner or whatever it might be. So it's interesting because, the technology is pretty much there now where obviously that can be done, and it has been done in some projects where they try to, sort of show this and demonstrate it and try to get their employees to buy into it and so forth. But at the same time, the whole reason behind it is that one singular line. What can we do to move that number, as low as possible so that our operating expenses are virtually nothing? Okay, make sense? Okay, all right.
And they had to meter every room.
I'm sorry?
It was probably expensive to have a meter in every room.
Yeah, but I mean, it's the sort of thing that, once again, the cost of so much of that now, the monitoring aspect, is almost non-existent. I mean, I'm assuming that, several of you probably even have like Nest thermostats and things like that, I do, and I think it's great, because, you can easily say, oh my gosh, I left it on, whenever I, left, I don't really want to leave it on, or, I'm coming home, I want to turn it on, or, whatever. But I mean, that convenience definitely, and then also being able to see, what your consumption is a great thing. Okay, sort of moving down the page a little bit, let me come down to vacancy collection loss. So, there have been several studies that have shown that energy efficient green buildings have a higher occupancy than those that aren't. And part of the rationale is, very simply put, people are beginning to actually make that informed decision of saying, I want to be in an energy efficient building because I know that my utilities are going to be less. Therefore, I am not going to locate in this ordinary building, even though the rent might be a little bit cheaper. It makes sense for me to be over here. Is that?
And everything being equal, people
Right.
totally gravitate toward the more energy
Right.
because they're more.
Now, once again, we can, and some of the early adopters and implementers of some of these things that they put into buildings, without getting gross about some of them, but the point being is, if the building felt and reacted no differently in the positive aspects of occupancy, then why would you not choose the more energy efficient one? I mean, the biggest one, I always hesitate to bring it up because we'll be grossed out, but the waterless toilets, I mean, those things are just nasty. I mean, I'm sorry, there's no other way to put it. They're just nasty, but they're huge water savers. Huge, but it's one of those sort of ideas that while, that was a big thing for a while, then they began to realize that the complaints and the kind of environmental aesthetics of it were such that, we're probably not going to do that anymore,
Not the regular, not the urinal, but the regular toilets, right?
Well, both, in some instances, yeah. Okay, like I said, I don't want to go down that path. Some things I don't mind talking about, that is a little bit too much, even for me. Okay.
Is there any type of way that you can actually get the difference between
Yes.
the vacancies per?
So one of the things that has become more commonplace are different rating agencies US government rating agencies that provide information, in some cases building by building. Also, you have the different certifications, like LEED has been probably the most dominant one. And so with LEED, you've got a variety of different levels. You've kind of got LEED certified, and then you've got LEED silver, LEED gold, and LEED platinum. And each of those stair steps is a higher level of sustainability that over time, changes. That what was, let's say, a LEED gold a few years ago might only be LEED certified now, simply because the standards and the improvements that have been made in technology and materials and that sort of thing has evolved. But the idea behind it is that as a tenant, that's an easy thing to sort of research. You can just hop on the LEED.org website and literally do a search for any building, any city, and say, show me all of the LEED gold office buildings in, Miami, Florida. And so you would be able to kind of go in and say, okay, well, here's the listing. And if you're a property owner and yours is not on the list, then to what extent do you get overlooked by that tenant that is being proactive, and actually searching for that sort of stuff. And see, this is the whole thing that, with the Internet of Things, clearly we have much more access to this than we've ever had, of being able to really, if you want to do your due diligence, you can find that sort of stuff so easily and get a lot of information up front before you ever even go and talk to the property owner. Now, one of the things that I saw that was particularly inspirational in the context of this, that in the city of Sydney, Australia, they actually had a system, Neighbours, National Australian Building and Environmental something, regulatory system or something. Anyway, the point being is this system gave a building by building rating code of the energy efficiency. And so that once again, and they had to prominently display it like in the lobby of the building. Sort of thing you'd walk in the elevator bays and here be, it's the same sort of thing like going into a restaurant and saying, okay, here's the restaurant's, sort of score for the health and safety or whatever, sanitation, what's what I'm looking for. You get the idea. But the point is that by making it so prominent, then it also would cause other property owners to be embarrassed because they didn't have it, or they didn't have as high of a score as somebody else, so that they could use it as just, another, way to try to, motivate people to, come into compliance or to enhance their level of sustainability. Yep.
Well, there's also a lot more standards that are coming out. For example, they have the Green Building Initiative. There's also a lot that's being done with offices and hospitals, specifically one program called FitWell, which I actually studied a little bit in my undergrad. And it's all about not just the sustainability in terms of like the environment, but also for the health of the people.
Yes.
And that also is another way that people are bringing in more tenants, et cetera, because they're like, oh,
It's a healthy building.
it's a healthy building.
Yeah.
It reduces the costs for also the employers on health insurance because
Yes.
they're not using it as much.
Right. Fit well. Yeah, this is something, strangely enough, you mentioned that particular component. Any of you that are members of ULI, did you get a survey within the past couple of weeks about the Healthy Building Initiative? No?
Yes. I didn't complete it. I thought it was asking me who I wanted the next president to be. Next president of ULI.
Well, you might have gotten a survey about that too, I don't know, but the one that came in probably about a week or so ago was from the Healthy Building Initiative, and it was basically getting at a lot of these, specific issues like FitWell and then some others, and basically surveying the membership of ULI as to what they thought about these things and what they thought were the most important and how they were responding and yada yada yada. And it could also be that as a student member, maybe they didn't send it to you. I don't know. Maybe they didn't. But in any event, the point being is this is definitely on the forefront of a lot of people's minds as to sort of dealing with this, because if you can tie things to the health, not only health conscious nature of people, but you know, really reduce their sick time by having buildings that are going to be more, what's the, you know, aesthetically pleasing, and but also the air quality is higher.
They also, by design, for example, for Fitwell, they actually require you to have a staircase that's prominent so that you actually use the staircase instead of the elevators, which is one major factor. Another one is also using maternity rooms. So they have nursing stations with a lot of natural light, so then workers can actually bring their children to work with them. So they're not losing, again, a lot of time.
Right. Yeah, one of the things, you know, when we think about this whole thing of, you know, like even just air quality, and this was a problem, oh geez, several years ago. It's actually a problem with any time a building sits vacant for any length of time, especially, you know, whether it's a house or whether it's an office building, especially even in this part of the country, you know, that if your air conditioner has not been running for a significant period of time, what happens? You get mold, okay? And that mold, you may not see it, you may not smell it, you may not taste it, but it's there, you know? And, you know, to what extent that, you know, those systems not being in operation for a significant period of time, you know, it builds up, and then all of a sudden you turn it on and, you know, you're blowing all those spores, you know, everywhere, and, you know, you're wondering, why is everybody getting sick? You know, and it happens a lot, you know, whenever you've had buildings that, you know, maybe have sat dormant, maybe just even for a few months, because, you know, those things begin to sort of build up. But that was, you know, something that, believe it or not, only until a few years ago did they really even think about or monitor, or, you know, so it's, but after you get enough cases of people, you know, with those kinds of issues and problems resulting from, you know, poor air quality, it begins to, you know, people begin to take notice, okay? All right. So let's, any other thoughts or questions before we kind of move back to this for a second? Yep, Jeff.
Here at Nova, we have an ice plant, and it generates ice at night when the cost of energy is cheaper. That's how commercial energy works. So the air that's blowing out of here right now is from ice that was produced last night.
Gotcha.
It's shipped out via chilled water to about 40% of the campus.
Yeah, this is an interesting thing that a lot of people don't realize is that, like, you know, whenever you've got college campuses or a lot of corporate campuses, in many cases, you know, they have centralized, you know, chilling, you know, plants. They have centralized, in some cases, you know, they produce their own electricity. They, you know, do a, you know, it's like almost a city unto itself in some instances. And there's a, you know, sort of a whole aspect of this facilities maintenance that many of us don't even think about. You know, in terms of the unique characteristics, because we always sort of think of every building being in sort of isolation and separate and apart from every other building, as opposed to, you know, more of an organic structure where you're able to kind of hopefully be more efficient by, you know, doing these sorts of things and thinking about how much is this going to save us, you know, in operational costs.
You get like a $500,000 rebate check for that.
There we go. Okay. All right. Other comments, thoughts, observations before we kind of move back with this? Okay. So let's just put, I mean, you can kind of play around with this a little bit. Let me just kind of zoom it out a little bit, so whether you can read this or not, that's going to be okay for the moment, because you can, let's see here. Just try to zoom into about right there. Let's see. Okay, all right, so let's just say, just to kind of play around with things here a little bit, maybe our construction costs are $250 per square foot. Okay, so now you begin to see some of these other things beginning to populate. Okay, so that represents 25%, you know, difference or increase in cost. And the square footage is probably going to be the same, although one could make an argument. Do you, like, thinking about this, from this standpoint, office space? You know, do we need to give? And this is, you know, a fundamental question they've, you know, been trying to get their heads around for many years. Does everybody need a closed-in office versus open space versus some limited closed-in offices, some open space offices, some kind of hybrid cubicles? Because on a cost basis, this can be huge, you know, in terms of the amount of space that you're air conditioning and cooling and lighting and so forth. Or even, other elements. If you live in a really hot climate, the cost of air conditioning, typically like this space, it's immediately adjacent to the windows, up to maybe like 6 or 7 feet, is very different than air conditioning the rest of the space, out here, because of the heat that's being obviously generated. Even with some of the best energy efficient windows, you're still going to, have some, heat gain from, coming in, here. So you have designers that obviously know that, and they will. I've seen some really weird examples of this, but where you'll have the designer purposely design the office buildings where the walkways will be the spaces adjacent to the windows. And then the workspaces will start over here for that very reason. But the problem, of course, is that most everybody wants a window for their office, and so the user ends up shifting all these, offices immediately adjacent to the windows, and to keep that space consistently cool, they have to spend like an extra 20 or 30% on air conditioning cost just to accommodate basically that one little issue. Okay, does that make sense? Or the situation of a designer saying, we're designing the space to where it's going to be available to be used from, let's say, 7 o'clock in the morning until 6 o'clock at night, okay? And that's going to be the parameter of when the space gets used. But then, all of a sudden, you have tenants move in, and you have a handful of folks that, for whatever reasons, are working outside those hours. Well, now you've got to heat and cool spaces that you weren't anticipating heating and cooling and lighting, in those off hours. Well, that's a huge cost. I mean, if they just turn the air conditioning off, here at 6 o'clock at night, that's great. But yet, then people are going to suffer because obviously, they're working or taking classes or whatever it might be. So, just little things like that, just to kind of pop back in your head. Okay, but my point with the square footage was, it could very well be that with the energy efficient building, that you may not actually need as much physical space if you design it in such a way that you can kind of minimize the actual space consumption per person. Okay, make sense? Okay, so we can even adjust that a little bit. Let's just say, what the heck, we lower it down to maybe 90,000. Okay, 10% reduction. All right. Then land acquisition cost. I can't imagine there really being much of a difference between the cost of the land for an ordinary building and a highly energy efficient one. I'm sure that if we thought long and hard enough, we might be able to come up with something. But other than, I guess there might be a situation of, this was like a brownfield site that the local government was trying to get you to locate on in order to reuse that site. So you might get the land for nothing. Okay, under those circumstances. So we can sort of say, okay, well, we get free land. All right, so right there, I know we're just playing around a little bit, but you get the general idea of what we're saying, that even though we have a more expensive cost of construction, we've got a smaller building, we're getting our land for free, we're getting this rebate from the city, and in this case, we're still more expensive than we would be over here at the ordinary building, but yet some of those costs are being defrayed, okay? Does that make sense? That's all this model is meant to do. It's not meant to be, obviously anything more than just kind of to give you some kind of ballpark ideas as to what the changes might be. Okay, then we come down here, those who've already made some changes, we go from maybe a 15-year term to maybe a 20-year term, so 240 months with the energy efficient building. We come down, okay, all those have already been sort of adjusted, so forth, so on. Now, what really matters, okay, after everything has been said and done, what we're saying here, with all the adjustments that we've made for all the financing piece, as well as kind of some of the operational sorts of things, this is what we're really sort of concerned with from the developer's point of view. Can we effectively charge less rent for the building than the ordinary building? Not saying that you're going to be able to, But, you know, that would certainly be a goal to have, is if there's a way with all of these different incentives in place, and even if you don't charge less, the ability to charge less would mean that you could probably actually charge what they're charging and then keep the rest as extra profit. And this is what has happened with a number of property owners, is they've figured that out and sort of said, oh, what if we make our building really energy efficient, and then instead of really, you know, conveying all that, you know, to the tenant, we just simply say, we're going to give you a gross lease, okay? And in that gross lease, we're going to charge you a rate that is very competitive with what the net lease with expenses would be with an ordinary building, and you're thinking you're getting a heck of a deal, but yet the reality is we're keeping all the extra for ourselves as the developer because we can. That's a win-win, you know, in that sort of circumstance.
Wouldn't you even be able to charge more just because you're including them?
Well, I mean, once again, it depends on how you're marketing it. I'm not a marketing guy, you know, I'm a finance guy. So, you know, I'm sure that there are some of you that can come up with some great schemes as to, you know, how you would potentially market this to a prospective, you know, tenant or a prospective investor, developer, whoever it might be. But, you know, from my perspective, if I can, you know, initiate a number of different cost savings, and then that translates to a situation of where I can potentially charge a lower rate, but I don't charge that lower rate, and I take advantage of the circumstances, at least for as long as I can, then, you know, that gives me a lot of incentive to potentially move in that direction. Okay? Thoughts? I know you're getting tired, but, you know, give me a couple more thoughts. I mean, do you think developers should care about any of this?
Yes.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Well, as a designer, I'm kind of biased, so.
Okay, so what's your perspective?
Well, in my perspective, it's easier to market a building that is more green, because right now, especially with the younger generation, that's like one of their biggest focuses, as well as, again, for incentives for the older population. They're like, oh, maybe it'll end up being cheaper, like you were saying. So overall, I just think it's a win-win-win situation. It's just it costs a little bit more upfront. However, you get your return on investment a lot better with a sustainable building versus the regular building.
Okay.
At the embassy, I just left in Malta. It was a LEED building, LEED certification, and it had hundreds of solar panels, and had a windmill. They installed a windmill. It was a fairly new building. It was only about 5 years old, so 6 years old. And we had an inspector general come out, did a kind of an inspection on us, and they looked at the cost to install all that stuff. It was going to take us 150 years to recoup the cost, because they installed this really expensive, you know, above the parking lot solar array, and they filled the yard with their.
This goes back to my point that I was making earlier. The reason, two things. Number one, it was a government organization.
Yeah.
Number two, it was all about that upfront cost. That it's so much easier as a government entity to say we need to get a lot of other extra money up front to build something than it is to get that long-term operational cost. And then also on top of this, the GSA, the General Services Administration, which is basically the real estate arm of the federal government, they actually have requirements that pretty much, it's all federal buildings, or virtually most every federal building has to be at least LEED Gold certified. Okay, and all of this is being done for those very reasons I was talking about earlier. That, you know, they're saying, you know, we would much rather spend a lot more money up front and hopefully, you know, capture some little savings. But sometimes, yes, there's no question about it. They go overboard and get a little crazy, you know, I mean, because really the cost benefit is just not there, you know. But you know, kudos for trying, but at least
They didn't do it for that. I mean, they're not the government isn't a money-making organization.
Right.
They're a money-spending organization.
yes.
So, They did it for the we're projecting what America to the local, to the country, and we're being energy efficient on the cutting edge, and that's the reason, I think, was the main reason.
Yep.
Another thing that I know a lot about is that people are installing these types of solar panel systems and window systems because they actually get refunds from
Yes.
the local power grid.
No, in some cases, actually, you can go so far that if, during certain times of the year, if you produce more electricity than you use, you actually sell it back to the, whoever your particular provider is. So there's, all sorts of incentives there. But, also, as I said earlier, the technology improves dramatically, and so, while a lot of, like the solar panels, and whether the wind turbines and other forms of power generation and whatever, that as those things, become cheaper, as they become more, advanced, then, because there are all kinds of things of like building your entire external of your building, literally from floor or, well, outside, your windows, everything is one big solar panel. But it doesn't look like a solar panel. It simply has a coating that effectively has the same properties as a solar panel that allows, that much more, to be captured. But in any event, it's one of those sorts of things that I think it's important that we think about these things as, developers, investors, and be aware of the potential for the cost savings and try to incorporate that. Okay, Ryan?
I kind of compare it to lighting and incandescent to LED. So now the ROI is just so apparent, but even in years past, there was still a pretty clear return on investment for switching to these LED technologies. But I guess some consumers' fear would be that next year the ROI of the technology is better.
Right.
So missing out on next year's, exponential improvements.
Yeah,
and
or the
seeing-
quality of them. I mean, the first sets of LEDs, some of them were just horrible in terms of the lighting quality and that sort of thing compared to incandescent lights, but
from solar panels to anything,
Yeah.
for that example.
Color rendering indexes as well, for example, lighting,
Foam.
color rendering indexes, they can't match it with LEDs as they can to incandescent and fluorescent still. So that's another huge thing that they're trying to develop, especially within the artists' communities. You have to have
Sure.
incandescent or fluorescent
Right.
because LEDs just don't cut it.
right.
I'm having trouble interpreting the last line. That's.
This one, in this particular case, the way that we had the model sort of set up, based upon the amount of equity that we put in, we're actually getting a lower return, but that's only because, kind of go back up here, we've got a larger than normal sort of project cost, but we also are getting a higher loan-to-value ratio, meaning we're borrowing, in one sense, more money, we've got a longer loan term. So we've got a lot of things that are kind of working against us, but if we kind of go back and we sort of modify those and kind of, so we can compare complete apples to apples, and we'd probably see that we can get a higher overall rate of return. But the other thing that we can do is, just sort of, I'm gonna do this just to see if it, I'm gonna regret it probably, but let's just say we put that, it should, no, it doesn't change it. I can't remember whether I had that, no, okay. Forget that, I'm something back just to change it back.
Okay,
But I understand what you're asking.
That's your return then.
That is your return, but as I said, if you go back up and you're gonna see, part of the reason for that is you may be putting in more money up front, or you may be, in terms of the kind of the counteracting forces to adjust for
It's
that.
less, but you're gonna save a lot on energy, so.
Right.
in the end.
Okay, other questions? Yep,
I just, for anybody putting in new impact windows, when we went to impact windows for our homeowners, which is the new code you have to go to anyway, our air conditioning expert said go to LowE, low emissions, and it cuts your energy cost like by at least 30% because all the heat comes through their windows. So for the homeowners of Habitat, we went to LowE and we brought our energy calcs down where it's Energy Star. We don't certify them, but it's a standard and LEED standard like that. So overnight, it costs us $1,000 more per unit to put the LowE in, but our homeowners on the return, in 3 years they got all the money, but well,
Right.
it's better for them, and overall, in 3 years, it's such an energy savings, it's unbelievable, Windows.
And you wouldn't even
the heat
necessarily
comes
have to put them on all four sides, depending on the orientation of the sign.
through. It's probably true, but.
Yeah, I know, I'm just saying, but yeah, that would be another, because that obviously is gonna
Well, just
impact.
building your house north and south and
Right.
east and west is huge on your energy savings.
Does it work the other way too, like if it's in a cold climate and you heat your house?
Yeah.
Does windows work the same way?
It probably is the opposite on a higher, in a different
Mhm.
climate, but for Florida, with all that heat that we get,
Yeah.
it makes a gigantic difference in your energy. And it was $1,000 more per house, and I'm like, that's a no-brainer,
So it
so.
blocks the heat.
Yeah, it emits the heat back out. Instead of going through, it emits it outwards.
But if you're in winter, you don't want those windows.
When it's winter in Florida, it's not here.
In New York or something.
Tell me when it shows up.
Exactly.
Saying there's another state.
Just a couple of other things to sort of point out that USGBC, United States Green Building Council, is the organization that's kind of the professional association that actually administers all of the different LEED certifications. And one of the things that you can do, and I've had a handful of students that have gone through and they've gotten these certifications as like LEED Green Associate and so forth. And it's just another thing that you may, be able to generate some consulting income off of, depending on kind of where you're located, be able to go into properties that are undeveloped and then offer your unbiased, sort of third-party kind of evaluation of the things that are being done by those developers to help them to achieve the certification and to verify. The problem with a lot of the certification, the LEED certification for the buildings is you will have some developers that will simply say, it's just not worth the paperwork, it's not worth the brain damage, it's not worth the expense of the certification. They will still go ahead and do all of the things that would ordinarily be done in a LEED certified property, but they just don't go through all of the actual certifying of those things by LEED simply because, as I said, there's a lot of expense associated with that. Because there's nothing that precludes you as an owner to go in and put highly energy efficient windows or air conditioning systems or whatever it is. What LEED does is it basically is third-party verification that you have done these things so that someone on the outside can very quickly see what you've done. What I'm trying to find real quick, I don't want to spend a whole lot of time, but just let's see, I think this is maybe 100 projects. Yeah, here we go. All right, so this, if you can go into this and search projects all across the country and the world, and specifically, let's just start with this is just hospitality. Okay. So there's some hotel projects. This is the multifamily systems in here locally. And actually, let's do something in Miami. Let's see what pops up.
Oceanographic Institute is the
Is it Nova's Sea School? Did I hear that there's a school on the beaches?
Okay, so a couple projects in Miami. These are hospitality, it looks like. Let's just see what they've got. Just out of curiosity.
Families, residential.
Okay, no, it's multifamily, I'm sorry. Okay, certification and process. All right.
What's the BD plus C?
Building development and construction.
Okay.
Okay. So several properties. Let's see here. Let's see this one's doing. Maybe, okay, here we go. So this is what I was trying to pull in. All right. So for this particular property, it gives a scorecard for the property in terms of what are the different sort of areas and what their relative scores are for each of these. Then you can probably go in, I'm assuming, and break them out in a little bit more detail. Oops. Or maybe not, but you could. oh, there we go. And what their score was on each component within that. And you can, like I said, you can just drill down on some of these things and you know, get some ideas, but it's also just kind of a interesting thing to see what kinds of things that they're actually sort of rewarding folks for. So just on the site piece, stormwater design, okay, once again, like we talked about earlier, brownfield redevelopment, okay, light pollution reduction, okay.
And the heat island effect, is that like, you know, was that was?
Well, on the roof, like for example, like if you have a white roof that reflects, and that's going to be a very positive thing, like as opposed to a black roof, you know, in terms of it's going to basically suck in all the heat into the building. Now, if you're in a cold climate, that could be not such a bad thing. But the white roofs are obviously going to sort of reflect back, and it has, you know, a huge savings on creating, you know, a heat island.
So, I mean, is it more desirable to reflect the heat? But is that, wasn't that, was anyone in our site planning class that was reading about how that's like heating up the atmosphere more? Is that what it was, the topic?
That was
that
the
was
effect
the,
is basically when it's heating up the metropolitan area, because there's so many of those structures that are absorbing the heat or like bringing in the heat. So there's ways to counteract that again with the green roofs or painting your roof white, other sorts of ways like that.
So just to kind of, we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on this, but I just wanted to sort of let you sort of see, okay, so like water efficiency, something we didn't really talk about, water efficient landscaping. So this is one of the things that you'll see properties that will collect all of their rainwater and then not process it. You know, just basically keep it in storage, you know, containers on site, and then purposely then will pump it out to just for irrigation purposes. And then they usually will have, like on the nozzles and things like that, you know, do not drink this water. You know, in essence, this is, you know, rainwater or reclaimed water or whatever it might be.
They have that on campus, right?
More than likely.
Because I
That's
think I've
surprising.
seen some signs around.
It's very, very possible.
Right there.
Okay, and then moving on down, like okay, energy performance, on-site renewable energy, measurement and verification of basically the things that you're putting into place we talked about earlier, green power, okay. Let's see, we've also got
Again, what's the URL for that?
just usgbc.org. Okay, so like on materials, this is a big one. Being able to reuse materials that are already there, either on site or reclaimed materials, recycled content, rapidly renewable materials, obviously like wood, and then the certified wood, depending on where it's sort of sourced, can be of great value. Let's see. Okay. And this gets into the whole thing about the air quality. Oh yeah, this is a big one. Believe it or not, like carpets can off-gas all sorts of really hazardous chemicals. I mean, this is one of those sorts of things. It's kind of like, you know, whenever you walk into a new house or you get a new car, and that new car smell or the new, well, most of us would think, oh, that smells really great. It's really toxic, which is, you know, it's something that's not good for you. But anyway, getting on down, once again, more air quality kinds of things, and then taking into account, what
these things on the left-hand side, EQ, C1, is that something that's
standards.
That's something clickable?
Environmentally, environmental quality standard, and probably, you probably click on that and it'll pull up
It'll tell you, I think,
the
about
exact
all the
details.
different ways you
It's
can
taking a
do
while
it.
to pull up, but it's going to probably tell you what are the measurable standards for that particular. There we go, right there.
Okay.
What
What is, okay,
there you go.
that's good. That's a lot of information then.
Okay. Oops. All right, and the last ones is real quickly, we give innovation credits. Then this would be, you know, once again, something that would be cutting edge in terms of the design, you know, that maybe no one has really ever thought about before, and all of a sudden these folks do it, and wow, had no idea, well, that, you get some points for that. And then there may be, you know, whoops, yellow. Points given, depending on where you happen to be located geographically, and what those, what values may be. So the idea, without, you know, so we're not trying to get into all the little nitty gritty on this clearly, but, you know, these are the major categories that they're looking at for LEED certification. So just from the standpoint of being aware of what some of those things are, you know, and being able to kind of go in and research that and see whether or not there are things that, you know, you might want to take advantage of as a developer, I think, you know, there's some real value in that, okay? All right, other questions, comments, observations? I know you want to take the quiz, so we'll take the quiz. Let's see. Let's see, what else? I think that's pretty much it. Okay.
And you? I'm wanting to go too. It ends the season.
Okay,
Shouldn't eat that turkey for lunch.
so here's the plan. We're gonna do the quiz. The remainder of the time is yours to be able to use however you want to, but my actual suggestion, and I'm being very serious when I say this, if you're not making progress on your final project for this class, you need to take some time and invest in that and do that today, and not complain to me I didn't have any time to work on that. Because in essence, I'm giving you a couple of hours to work on it, okay? So there better not be any excuses.
He's only one all day. Should I go back to the one we didn't modify? Oh, I see, I didn't. I'm just saying.